October 1872. Louisiana Bayou Country. A church bell begins to ring, 12 times. Slow. Deliberate. No hand on the rope. No service. No wind. By sunrise, 7 souls have vanished. Supper still warm on the table. A single chair overturned. And the only thing left behind was silence. And the shadow of something that had come to collect. The people of Harrow Bluff still flinch when a bell rings after dusk. Not from cannon fire. Not from the scream of a hurricane tearing through the cypress knees. They flinch because, for the rest of their lives, that sound dragged them back to one Tuesday evening in October 1872 when Calvary Road Baptist rang 12 times, and kept ringing inside their bones long after the last echo died. 12 strikes. Not hurried like a fire alarm. Not joyful like a wedding. Each one measured, patient, the way a judge brings down a gavel when the verdict has already been decided in heaven. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, the Voclain family, the oldest, richest, most untouchable bloodline in St. Genevieve Parish, had been erased as cleanly as chalk from a slate. No blood. No footprints leading away. No horses stolen. Just an empty house still breathing with the warmth of living bodies, and one chair at the head of the table lying on its back like a man who had stood up to meet his maker. This is not a ghost story. This is a reckoning. 7 years after Appomattox, the South wore the mask of peace, but underneath it the wounds still bled. Plantations that once ran on 200 voices now ran on whispers and resentment. Freedmen walked the same roads as their former masters, and every glance between them carried the weight of chains that had only changed shape. In the Atchafalaya basin, the water remembered everything, every lash, every auction, every whispered prayer for deliverance that had gone unanswered for generations. Harrow Bluff was never meant to be found on any map drawn in New Orleans or Washington. It sat on a narrow spine of high ground where the bayou grudgingly gave way to solid earth, a cluster of weathered buildings wrapped in Spanish moss and secrets. Dupree's general store smelled of tobacco, molasses, and gun oil. The blacksmith's hammer rang like conscience at odd hours. The post office was a kitchen table 3 mornings a week, and letters were read aloud whether you wanted them to be or not. At the western edge, Calvary Road Baptist rose white and stern above the trees, its steeple the first thing sailors saw when they pulled their pirogues out of the mist. Built in 1841 by men who believed God was on their side even when they were breaking His commandments. That bell had tolled for births, for deaths, for Confederate victories, and for Confederate funerals. But never, never at night. Never on a Tuesday. Never 12 times with pauses long enough for a grown man to walk from porch to property line and back while counting every single strike. Yet on October 14, 1872, that is exactly what it did. The sound rolled across the water like something alive. Elias Fontenot was sliding the bolt across his store door when the first toll hit him between the shoulder blades. He froze, key still in the lock, and counted. 1, 2, 3. His wife Dor, coming up the muddy lane from her sister's, stopped dead in her tracks, lantern swinging wildly in her hand. The Yankee schoolteacher, Mr. Graves, writing lesson plans by candlelight in his boarding-house room, set down his pen and stared at the wall as if the plaster itself had begun to speak. 12. Then nothing but the insects and the frogs and the terrible, sudden understanding that something holy, or unholy, had just finished its business. No one ran to the church right away. That is the part that still shames the old ones when they tell it. The sound carried such finality that every soul in Harrow Bluff felt, in their marrow, that whatever had rung that bell was already done with them. Fontenot later swore the tone felt like a door closing on the other side of eternity. Dor said the cold that settled in her chest had nothing to do with the October air. Only Graves, the outsider, finally walked the 300 yards to Calvary Road. He found the heavy oak door unlocked, as always. The rope hung perfectly still, not even trembling. No footprints in the thin dust at the base of the tower. The candles on the altar were cold. The sanctuary smelled of old hymnals and wet pine. Whatever had pulled that rope had not needed hands. He wrote it all down that night in the journal his granddaughter would one day donate to an Ohio library. The entry ends with a single underlined sentence: the South is learning that some debts are collected by instruments far older than the Union Army. 3 miles south, the Voclain plantation slept under the same amber sky. The big house was not the grandest, no marble columns like the ones in Natchez, but it had roots older than the Louisiana Purchase. The Voclains had survived yellow fever, British cannon, the flood of '49, and, most painfully, the war that had stripped them of their legal claim to other human beings. Colonel Edouard Voclain, 53 years old, had ridden home in 1865 with one arm stiff from a mini ball and a ledger full of debts he refused to write down. His face, once handsome in the careless way of rich men, had hardened into something the servants said reminded them of weathered cypress, gray, unreadable, enduring. His wife Henriette moved through the house like a woman balancing on a razor's edge. Every decision, every word, measured 3 times before spoken. She had learned early that her safety depended on the temperature of her husband's moods. Their children carried the fractures of that household in different ways. Theodore, 26, eldest son and heir, wore his father's temper like a loaded pistol with the safety filed off. Unmarried, reckless, he spent nights in the quarters that no longer officially belonged to the family, drinking with men who still called him Massa out of habit and fear. Adele, 22, had buried her fiancé the year before a typhoid, and something in her had never been reburied with him. She drifted through the days in half-mourning, eyes always on the horizon as though waiting for a letter that would never come. Lyon, 17. Spoke so little that people forgot he was in the room until he left. His silence was not empty, it was full of things seen, things heard, things never to be repeated. Little Margot, 13, had her mother's watchful eyes and her father's refusal to cry where anyone could see. She kept a small wooden cross under her pillow and prayed every night for the souls of the people her family had once owned. And then there was Aunt Celeste, 71, sharp as a cane knife, nearly deaf but hearing everything that mattered. Before the war she had run the household with an iron wool wrapped in lace. She still occupied the east wing, Bible always open, reading glasses folded neatly on top like a promise she intended to keep. 8 people lived under that roof if you counted August. August had no last name in the parish records. 44 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way mountains are quiet. Born into bondage on Voclain land, he had stayed after emancipation not out of loyalty, but because the world outside these gates had even less mercy for a black man with no papers, no kin, no coin. He worked the fields, repaired the levees, spoke only when spoken to, and remembered every name, every lash, every child sold away downriver before the war. The family called him the help. The town called him the one who knows. He was not inside the house the night the bell rang. He was the one who found what the bell had left behind. The evening of October 14th began like any other. The light turned the color of old bourbon over the water. Cypress knees rose like prayerful hands from the swamp. Wood smoke and frying cornbread drifted from the kitchen wing. Inside the dining room, 7 places were set. Sweet potatoes glazed with sorghum. Fresh bread. A bottle of claret that had survived the war by being buried under the smokehouse floor. They ate in near silence. Edouard at the head, carving the ham with short, angry strokes. Henriette watching every face. Theodore drinking. Too fast. Adele pushing food around her plate. Lyon staring at his hands. Margot stealing glances at the empty chair where August usually took his evening meal when invited, which was never. Outside, the insects began their nightly machinery. Inside, the candles burned lower. At 7 o'clock, the bell began. The sound reached the plantation like a summons. Edouard's knife paused mid-air. Henriette's glass trembled. Theodore's chair scraped back half an inch. Adele's lips moved in a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. Lyon closed his eyes. Margot reached for her mother's hand under the table. Aunt Celeste lifted her head as though she had heard her name called from the next room. 12 times. Then the terrible, ringing quiet. No one spoke of it. They simply stopped. The candles kept burning. The food cooled. And somewhere between the 7th and 8th toll, something passed through that house that had no business being among the living. August was checking the mule harness in the barn when the final strike faded. He felt it in his teeth. He stood still for a long minute, then walked to the edge of the yard and looked toward the distant steeple glowing faintly through the trees. A cold certainty settled over him, the same certainty he had felt the night they took his mother away when he was 9. Some doors, once opened, do not close again. He did not go to the big house until morning. When he did, the front door stood open. The brown hound that belonged to Theodore lay on the porch, chin on paws, watching him with ancient eyes. It did not bark. It did not follow him inside. The smell hit him first: warm wax, roasted sweet potato, and something underneath that had no name but made the hair on his arms rise. 7 plates. 7 glasses. 3 still holding wine. The serving spoon resting in the sweet potatoes as though someone had simply set it down mid-bite. Edward's chair lay backward on the floorboards, not smashed, not thrown, simply abandoned in the middle of rising. The candles had burned to stubs and drowned in their own wax. The stove in the kitchen was still warm. Upstairs, 2 beds were turned down but untouched. Margot's hairbrush waited on the dresser beside a half-finished sampler that read "The Lord is my shepherd." Adele's writing desk held a single sheet of paper, pen beside it, ink dry, no words begun. Aunt Celeste's Bible lay open to the book of Exodus, chapter 12, the Passover, her glasses folded neatly on the verse that speaks of the angel passing over the houses marked with blood. And in the narrow servants' hallway, the same hallway August had walked every day of his life, carrying trays, carrying secrets, carrying the weight of 2 centuries, 7 marks had been scratched into the plaster at shoulder height. Not letters. Not crosses. Just 7 vertical lines. Deep. Deliberate. The kind of marks a man makes when he is counting souls that are no longer his to count. Graves would later spend 3 full minutes staring at those marks before whispering, 7 for the 7 plagues, or 7 for the 7 years since the war ended. When the parish sheriff arrived 2 days later, he claimed the plaster had been damp and the marks had simply flaked away. No photograph was taken. No official report mentioned them. The county records that survived, the ones not sealed by judicial order, speak only of sudden departure and presumed relocation to Texas. But the people of Harrow Bluff knew better. They knew that on the night of October 14, 1872, the God who had heard the cries of the enslaved for 250 years had finally sent his answer in the only language the Voclains would understand: silence. 12 tolls. 7 souls. 1 overturned chair. And a plantation house that still stands today, shutters open, supper table forever set, waiting for a family that will never come home. Because some debts are not paid in cotton. Some debts are paid in absence. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right across the Atchafalaya at dusk, the old ones swear you can still hear it: faint, patient, final, the sound of a bell that has already finished its work and is waiting for the rest of us. The marks on the wall were the first thing Graves could never forget. He drew them that same night in his journal, 7 crude vertical slashes at shoulder height, the plaster still carrying the faint grit of whatever had clawed them there. For the next 40 years he would stare at that sketch in the quiet hours, turning it over in his mind like a man worrying a sore tooth. In 1889 he finally squeezed a single line into the margin of the original entry: they are not letters. They are a count. And the number they are counting is 12. 12 souls owed. 7 taken. The arithmetic of heaven, written in dust and fear. What followed the vanishing of the Voclain family was never truly an investigation. It was theater, men in dusty coats walking through the motions so the record books could be closed with a clear conscience and a clean page. In 1872 Louisiana, some truths were simply too expensive to unearth. Parish Sheriff Arzino arrived at the plantation on the morning of the 16th, 2 full days after August had staggered into Harrow Bluff with the news. He came with 2 deputies whose faces were already set in the careful blankness of men who had learned that some doors should stay shut. With them rode the parish judge, Harlan Pruitt, a lean, graying northerner sent down by Reconstruction authorities 3 years earlier. Pruitt had the tired eyes of a man who had arrived believing in justice and stayed long enough to understand that justice here had a price, and the price was usually silence. The house greeted them exactly as Fontenot, Graves, and Tebido had left it. Same warm stove. Same overturned chair at the head of the table. Same 7 plates with food congealing in the October heat. Same candles drowned in their own wax. Arzino walked the room slowly, boots echoing on the wide pine floors. He touched nothing. He asked August the same questions 3 different ways, watching the man's face like a card player looking for a tell. August answered in the quiet, measured cadence of someone who had spent his entire life choosing every word as if it might be used against him later. "I was in my quarters behind the house," he said. "Heard the bell. Counted 12. Looked toward the dining room windows, saw the candlelight moving. Family at supper. Looked normal. Went to bed. Came in the morning, and they weren't there." He volunteered nothing more. He was not asked about the argument in the stable 3 months earlier. He was not asked about the letters. He was not asked why his hands trembled slightly when he spoke the word normal. The sheriff's report, the one that survived, called the disappearance cause undetermined. The version sealed by Judge Pruitt and sent to New Orleans carried a different tone entirely, likely voluntary relocation due to financial pressures. No mention of the marks on the wall. When Graves pressed Arzino about them later, the sheriff ran 2 fingers along the plaster and shrugged. "Damp. Old house. Things flake off." But Graves had already copied the marks into his journal. And he had already begun to understand that the Voclain family had not simply left. They had been collected. Because the plantation had been dying long before the bell rang. The war had ended 7 years earlier, but for families like the Voclains the peace was worse than the fighting. Fields that once produced 200 bales of cotton a year now struggled to yield 80. The labor force, now legally free, had to be kept in place by something stronger than chains. The Voclains chose debt. Every freedman on the property was handed a contract written in language so dense it might as well have been Latin. Housing charged at twice market rate. Tools and seed deducted before wages were even calculated. Food from the plantation store marked up 300%. By 1872, every worker owed more than they had earned in their entire lives. The system was called sharecropping. The workers called it by its older name, slavery by another ledger. In March of that year, a Freedmen's Bureau agent named Whitfield had come riding up the same rutted road. He was a quiet, bespectacled man from Illinois who still believed the law mattered. He spent 3 days walking the fields, talking to the workers, examining the books August was never allowed to see. His report, what remains of it in the federal archives, is clinical, almost clinical in its horror. Conditions of informal bondage maintained through economic coercion, recommend immediate federal intervention. 6 weeks later, Agent Whitfield was quietly transferred to Arkansas. The report gathered dust. The debts remained. Then there was the mortgage. The Voclain land had been pledged to a New Orleans bank years earlier to keep the war effort afloat. By 1872 the bank, run by a man named Delacroix whose family had made its fortune financing both sides of the conflict, was calling in every note with Reconstruction-era ruthlessness. A representative had visited in September, 3 weeks before the bell. No one ever confirmed what was said in the parlor that afternoon, but August later told Graves he had seen Theodore pacing the veranda afterward like a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. And all of it, every dollar, every acre, every soul still bound to the land, circled back to one man. Colonel Edward Voclain. The man who had once sold human beings the way other men sold mules. Between 1857 and 1863, when cotton prices were high and the Deep South was hungry for labor, Edward had quietly moved surplus people downriver. Not through the big New Orleans auctions where records were kept. He used private brokers, nighttime transfers, forged papers that listed men and women as contract labor instead of property. The money came back in gold, never written in the family ledgers. Just enough to keep the plantation floating through bad seasons. Theodore had found the proof in New Orleans that July. August heard the argument from the storage shed beside the stable. He did not mean to eavesdrop, he had simply been repairing a harness when the voices rose. Theodore's voice, raw with whiskey and rage, "You sold a man who was not yours to sell." Edward's reply, colder than the bayou at dawn, "That is not what happened." "Then tell me what happened, father. Tell me where the money went. Tell me where he went." The voices dropped. Boots scuffed deeper into the stable. August pressed himself against the wall and heard only fragments after that: names, dates, the word mobile, the word prophet. When Theodore finally stormed out 2 hours later, he walked straight past August without seeing him. The shame on the young man's face was so naked it hurt to look at. That was the wound that had been bleeding inside the Voclain house for 3 months. The wound that made the supper table on October 14th feel like a last meal. The wound that made the church bell 12 times, once for every year of betrayal, or every tribe of Israel, or every hour the enslaved had cried out, sound like the final trumpet. In the months that followed, Harrow Bluff wrapped itself in a special kind of silence. Not the silence of ignorance. The silence of people who had watched their own mothers, fathers, children disappear into the night for decades and had never seen a sheriff lift a finger. Now the masters were gone, and the same people who once demanded answers for missing silver spoons suddenly discovered the virtue of minding their own business. Rosalie, one of the women who had worked the Voclain fields since she was 12, was interviewed by the deputies. She told them she had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. They did not ask her whether she had smiled when the bell tolled. They did not ask whether she had knelt that night and thanked a God who had finally answered prayers spoken in cotton rows and whipping posts. She died in 1881. No one ever recorded what she whispered on her deathbed. August stayed. 17 years later, when Graves returned to Harrow Bluff in 1889, he found the older man still living in the same small cabin behind the big house. The new owners, a hardware merchant from Shreveport, never asked why the cabin remained. They never asked who paid August's tiny wage. Some arrangements were simply understood. They sat on the weathered steps as the sun bled red across the Atchafalaya. August spoke for 2 hours without raising his voice above a murmur. Graves wrote every word. He spoke of the letters Theodore had found, letters Edouard had written in 1860 to a broker in Mobile, arranging the sale of a man named Isaiah, a skilled blacksmith, for $800 cash. Isaiah had a wife and 2 small children on the Voclain place. The wife was told he had run away. The children grew up believing their father had chosen freedom over them. He spoke of the night in 1862 when another young man, barely 19, was taken in chains after dark because Edouard needed money to buy new rifles for the Confederate company he commanded. That boy's name was never recorded. His mother still lived in the quarters in 1872. She had been at supper in the big house that final night, serving the family whose wealth was built on her son's back. He spoke of the way Edouard used to stand on the veranda after every sale, looking out over the fields as though counting his blessings, while somewhere downriver another family was being torn apart. And then August said the thing that made Graves stop writing for a full minute. Colonel Voclain thought the war would wash all that clean. Thought emancipation would erase the ledger. But some debts ain't written in ink, Mr. Graves. They're written in blood. And blood don't forgive. Blood remembers. When Graves asked if he believed the family was dead, August looked out across the empty fields for a long time. I believe they were called to account, he said finally. 12 times the bell rang, 1 for every major sale I know of. 7 of them taken, 1 for every living soul still under this roof who carried the stain. The chair at the head of the table was overturned because when the moment came, the colonel tried to stand, and found his legs would not hold him. Graves asked one last question. Do you think they suffered? August smiled for the first time in the entire conversation, a small, terrible smile that never reached his eyes. I think they finally understood what it feels like when no one comes looking for you. The big house still stands today. The new owners have changed the name, painted the shutters, planted new roses along the gallery. But on certain October evenings, when the light turns the color of old bourbon and the insects begin their machinery in the cypress roots, people who pass by on the river road swear they can see candlelight moving behind the dining room windows. 7 candles. Burning low. Never quite going out. And sometimes, if the wind is right, you can hear it faint, patient, final, the sound of a bell that has already finished its work, counting down the days until the next reckoning. Because the God of the bayou is slow. But he is never late. And some plantations are not abandoned. They are simply waiting for the rest of the payment to come due. The truth about the Voclain disappearance does not end with an overturned chair or 7 marks on plaster. It ends, or refuses to end, in the lower Atchafalaya, where the land dissolves into water and the water remembers every sin it has ever carried away. Graves never stopped chasing the shadow of those marks. In 1889, sitting on the steps with August under a sky turning the color of bruised fruit, he asked the question that had haunted him for 17 years, "What do you think happened to them?" August let the silence stretch until the insects filled it. "I have ideas," he said at last. "But ideas ain't proof. And proof is a thing white men use to protect themselves. Not to find the truth." He spoke then of Thomas Duffrain. A free man of color. Carpenter. Skilled. Promised freedom in 1851 by Edouard's own father, a document notarized in New Orleans, legally binding even under the twisted laws of the time. Edouard knew of it. He burned the copies that arrived, sold the man anyway in December 1858 to a cotton plantation in Sunflower County, Mississippi. $420. Enough to cover a debt and keep the big house painted white another season. August had helped Thomas write the letter requesting duplicates of his freedom papers 3 years before the war. He was the one who could read and write in secret. No reply ever came. They never knew why. Until the spring of 1872. Letters arrived at the Voclain house. August found them half-burned in Edouard's study wastebasket one August morning while sweeping. He recognized the handwriting on one envelope, the same careful script he had helped form years earlier. He did not read them. He replaced them carefully. Said nothing. 6 weeks later, the bell rang 12 times. Graves, driven by the sharpness of what August would not say, spent 4 years hunting fragments. New Orleans archives. Freedmen's Bureau ledgers yellowed with time. Courthouse dust. Attorney offices that still smelled of ink and old wax. He found the registry entry, freedom papers issued to Thomas Duffrain, 1851, notary Bodwin. The document itself vanished. The sale record, enslaved man, no conflicting status noted. Then, post-war, Thomas Duffrain, carpenter, age 45, registered with the Bureau in Natchez, 1867. Emancipated by the 13th Amendment. Working. Alive. In 1869 he went to New Orleans. A city directory in 1871 lists him in the Treme neighborhood. 1872 gone. No death certificate. No forwarding address. No trace. But one entry chilled Graves to the marrow, March 1872. Consultation with attorney Boneville. Recovery of status and damages. The case never filed. March 1872. 6 months before the bell. Theodore's trip to New Orleans that July. The argument in the stable. You sold a man who was not yours to sell. The Freedmen's Bureau report on the plantation in March recommending action buried when the agent was shipped to Arkansas. The creditor's representative in September, pressing the mortgage. And on October 14, 12 tolls at 7 in the evening. Graves wrote in his journal, November 14, 1893, 21 years to the day, if the bell was a signal, then the disappearance was arranged. Someone knew. Someone intended. He underlined it once. Then, through a colleague in New York, he reached Harlan Pruitt, the Reconstruction judge who had stood in the empty dining room in 1872. Pruitt had fled Louisiana in 1874, settled near Rochester. By 1893 he was in his 60s, fond of whiskey at twilight, looser with words than he had been in office. Graves visited twice. Pruitt asked him not to write while speaking. Graves transcribed from memory each night in his hotel. Pruitt told him this. In the week before closing the case in January 1873, Sheriff Arzino came to him privately. No official record. No signature. Just a quiet conversation outside the courthouse. Arzino had learned something. On the evening of October 14, after the bell, 7 people left the Voclain house on foot. Southward. Into the lower Bayou country. Seen by a fisherman named Henri Baptiste, working a line less than a quarter mile from the southern boundary. Dusk light. Poor visibility. distance. But he counted 7 figures moving with purpose along the water's edge, not stumbling, not fleeing in panic. Moving deliberately. And they were not alone. Other shapes kept to the tree line. Guiding? Following? Escorting? Baptiste could not count them. Could not describe them clearly. Only that they stayed in shadow while the 7 walked into the open. They headed south. Toward the heart of the Atchafalaya, flooded half the year, cut by channels no map ever held, navigable only by those born to its rhythms. Cypress knees rising like accusations from Blackwater. Spanish moss hanging in curtains that block the sun. Bayous twisting into dead ends, lakes filling with silt year by year, ground that sucks at boots until it claims them. The land there devours. Pruitt said Arzino believed, though he never said it on paper, that the 7 had not returned because the bayou had taken them. Willingly or not. That whatever walked with them knew the paths where even the alligators hesitate. Graves asked Pruitt one question: "Do you think they were forced?" Pruitt drained his glass. Looked out at the snow falling soft on upstate New York. "I think," he said, "they were summoned. Because the bell had rung 12 times, perhaps once for each year since Thomas Duffrain's sale began the chain of debt and blood. Perhaps once for each major betrayal Edouard had buried. And 7 were taken, one for each living soul who carried the stain of that sin into freedom's false dawn. The bayou is patient. It does not rush judgment. It waits for high water, for fog, for the moment when a man stands on his own porch and realizes the water has risen to his doorstep. Then it claims what is owed, quietly, without spectacle. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage. No note washed ashore. Only the house, still standing, supper forever cooling on the table. And sometimes, when the October moon hangs low over the Atchafalaya, fishermen swear they see shapes moving along the water's edge at dusk. 7 figures. Walking south. Followed by shadows that keep to the trees. They do not run. They do not look back. They simply walk, as though answering a bell that has been tolling inside their bones for 20 years. Because some reckonings do not need handcuffs or gallows. Some reckonings need only water and time. And the Atchafalaya has both in abundance. The big house waits still. Shutters open to the night air. Candles long burned away, but the wax remains hardened pools on silver holders like tears no one wiped away. And on still evenings, when the wind moves just right across the basin, you can hear it faint, measured, final. 12 tolls. Counting down. Not for them. For the rest of us. The Voclain family was not taken. They were escorted. There is a difference, and that difference is the difference between a crime and a reckoning. Sheriff Arzino understood at the moment Henri Baptiste whispered what he had seen. 7 silhouettes moving south along the water's edge at 8 o'clock, deliberate, unhurried, as though answering a summons they had known was coming. Accompanied, or perhaps guarded, by shapes that stayed in the tree line, counting steps the white men of Harrow Bluff would never be allowed to follow. Arzino never wrote it down. He carried it to Judge Pruitt in the week before the file was closed forever and spoke at once, quietly, the way a man confesses something he hopes will be forgotten by morning. Pruitt listened, swirled the last of his whiskey, and felt, he admitted years later in a snowbound house in upstate New York, relief. Raw, shameful relief. Because if the family had been found murdered, the investigation would have torn the parish apart. And in 1873, with Reconstruction gasping its last breath, no one could afford to discover who had finally answered 250 years of prayer with action. Better they simply walked away. Into the one place the law had never learned to read. So let us follow them. Let us walk where the maps end. The lower bayou country of St. Genevieve Parish in October 1872 was not wilderness. It was a hidden nation. A world the census takers never entered and the tax collectors could not reach. Generations of the forgotten had made their lives there, formerly enslaved men and women who had slipped the ledger, free people of color whose papers had been lost in courthouse fires, mixed-blood families who spoke French and Choctaw and the old African tongues their grandparents had carried across the water in chains. They knew which cypress knees hid solid ground when the flood came. They knew which Channels would carry a pirogue at night and which would swallow it. They knew that the white man's law stopped where the Spanish moss grew thick enough to block the stars. These were the people Thomas Duffrain had gone to after March 1872. He had not stayed in New Orleans waiting for courts that had already decided his case did not matter. He had gone south, to a sister whose name Graves never fully recovered, to cousins and friends who had once lived on the edge of the Voclain fields before Edouard sold them downriver. People who remembered the night Thomas was taken in 1858. People who had never stopped counting the years. Over 7 months they built something Graves could only call an arrangement. Not a conspiracy. Not a plot. An arrangement, quiet, precise, rooted in the same moral arithmetic the Voclains had ignored for decades. No one was to be hurt. That was the first condition. August confirmed it in his final letter to Graves in 1895, 3 years before his own death. No one was hurt. That was the condition. The second condition was simpler. Leave. Leave tonight. Leave everything. The house, the fields, the ledgers stained with other people's blood. Leave the parish. Leave the state if you want to keep breathing free air. Because the alternative was not a trial in New Orleans, though the evidence was now ironclad, the original Freedom Papers copied and recopied, the notary's registry entry, the letters Edouard had burned too late. The alternative was something older than courts. It was the bayou itself, rising in judgment. At approximately 7:15 on the evening of October 14, someone came to the back door, or sent word through the servants' passage. Perhaps a single figure. Perhaps more. What they carried was not a weapon. It was a packet of papers and a simple message. We know what you did to Thomas Duffrain. We know what you did to the others whose names you never bothered to record. The evidence is already in the hands of men who will use it. Or, you can walk. The chair at the head of the table fell backward because Edouard Voclain stood up too fast, not in rage, but in the sudden, crushing recognition that the God he had invoked every Sunday had finally answered. Not with fire from heaven. With 7 silent figures at his door and the weight of every soul he had sold pressing down on his chest. Henriette's hand went to her throat. Theodore's glass slipped from his fingers and did not break. Adele closed her eyes as though she had been waiting for this night since her fiancé died. Léon simply nodded once, as if the silence he had carried all his life had finally spoken. Little Margot reached for her mother's hand the way she had done since she was small. Aunt Celeste closed her Bible open to Exodus 12 and folded her glasses with the calm of a woman who had always known the angel of death would one day pass through this house. They left the candles burning. They left the supper warm. They left the horses in the stable and the dog on the porch. They walked south. 7 white figures moving through the October dark, guided by hands that had once picked their cotton, mended their fences, buried their dead. The same hands that had been told for generations that they were property now leading the owners into the one courtroom the owners could not buy. The bayou received them without ceremony. Water the color of strong tea. Cypress knees rising like the bones of drowned prophets. Spanish moss brushing their faces like the fingers of every ancestor who had ever whispered freedom in the quarters after dark. The ground sucked at their shoes, then their ankles, then their knees, the same mud that had once swallowed the blood of runaways now rising to claim the ones who had made the runaways bleed. No one spoke above a murmur. No one cried out. Because the condition had been clear, no one was hurt. And in the moral economy of the bayou, that promise was more binding than any contract Edouard Voclain had ever signed. Graves never found where they went after the water closed behind them. No death certificates. No land deeds. No marriage records under the Voclain name in Texas, Florida, or anywhere along the Gulf for the next 30 years. He found one fragile thread in the baptismal register of a small Catholic church in Galveston, Texas, 1874. A child born to parents listed as H. Wang and A. of Wang, ne Devo. The spelling was off, French clerks, tired hands, immigrant ears. But Graves circled it until the ink bled. Adele, 22 in 1872, mourning a dead fiancé, carrying the weight of her father's sins. 2 years later, across the water, beginning again under a name the bayou had washed clean. It was enough for him to write, in the final entry of his journal dated February 4, 1899, 11 months before his own quiet death in Ohio. I cannot prove they survived. I cannot prove they repented. But I can prove that on the night of October 14, 1872, the people of Harrow Bluff slept better than they had in 2 centuries. And that is testimony enough. The Calvary Road Baptist Church still stands, or what remains of it. The settlement of Harrow Bluff has melted back into the cypress like a dream the land decided to forget. A few foundation stones. A cemetery where most markers have surrendered their names to moss and rain. The elevated ridge is visible only if you know exactly where to look from a pirogue at dawn. The church building was patched twice in the 1890s, then abandoned around 1910. The bell was taken down sometime after that, no one remembers the exact year. The tower remains, open to the sky, its wooden beams silvered by more than a century and a half of Louisiana weather. On still October evenings, when the light turns the color of old bourbon, locals say you can stand beneath that tower and feel the air itself grow heavy, as though 12 measured strikes are still hanging there, waiting for someone to finish the count. The Voclain estate, what the New Orleans creditors did not seize, was distributed in 1876 to distant cousins who never came to claim it in person. There is no memorial. No plaque. Only a single file folder in the St. Genevieve Parish courthouse, 11 weeks of careful nothing. No follow-up on August's second interview. No mention of the Freedmen's Bureau report. No record of Henri Baptiste's sighting. No inquiry into the attorney in New Orleans who had dared to write recovery of status and damages. Absences so loud they scream. August died in 1898. He is buried on the edge of what was once Voclain land, in a small plot tended by people whose names were never written in any ledger. The marker is plain fieldstone. No date of birth. No surname. Only 4 words carved deep enough to outlast the rain. August. He remembered everything. That is the truest epitaph in the entire parish. The God who heard the blood of Abel crying from the ground had finally heard the blood of Thomas Duffrain, and Isaiah the blacksmith, and the 19-year-old boy sold for rifles, and every mother who watched her child disappear downriver. He did not send fire. He sent silence. And water. And the quiet, unstoppable machinery of consequence. 12 tolls, 1 for each tribe that had once been promised justice. 7 taken, 1 for each living soul who had profited from the sin and still sat down to supper as though the ledger were clean. The bayou does not forgive. But it does balance. And on certain nights, when the wind moves across the Atchafalaya just right, fishermen still see them, 7 pale figures walking south along the water's edge at dusk. They do not run. They do not look back. They simply walk, as though the bell is still ringing inside their bones, calling them onward to whatever redemption the water is willing to grant. Because some departures are not escapes. They are exiles. And some bells do not ring to announce death. They ring to announce that the day of reckoning has finally, mercifully, arrived. The house still waits, shutters open, table set, candles long drowned in their own wax. But the supper has gone cold for 153 years now, and no one is coming back to finish it. What do you believe happened that night? Did 7 sinners simply choose to walk away from everything they had built on other people's backs? Or did the God of the oppressed finally send his messengers, not in robes of light, but in the quiet hands of those who had nothing left to lose? Leave your answer below. We read every single one. And if this story has lodged itself somewhere behind your ribs, if you find yourself listening for a bell that has not rung in over a century, then you already understand why we keep telling these tales. Because some truths are too heavy for history books. They can only be carried by water. And by memory. And by the slow, patient, unstoppable justice of the bayou. Subscribe. Turn on notifications just once. Share this with someone who can still feel the weight of unfinished accounts. We'll see you in the next reckoning.